been Methodist my whole life. Since I was born, both sets of my grandparents have belonged to the Methodist Church. My mom and dad, before they got divorced, were both active in the Methodist Church, and I was raised in the Methodist Church, from Sunday school to confirmation classes to MYF and all of that. And despite that long experience, I think my faith as it stands now has best been impacted by the death of my grandparents. While I was in college, my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer, and after fighting it for several years, he was finally admitted into Scott and White Hospital for what we knew was going to be the last time. Now, my grandmother and my grandfather were both very active in their Methodist church and great people. They're the kind of people that would literally give you the shirt off their back. They sponsored a child in Africa before anybody really ever heard of it. And in the church, my grandmother taught the same Sunday school class, one of the most popular in her little Methodist church, for 30 or 40 years. And my grandfather wasn't one of the guys that was just there on Sunday, but he was one of those people that was up there several times a week. And during college, my granddad was diagnosed with cancer. And he fought the fight for several years, but finally he was admitted to Scott and White Hospital for what we were all sure was going to be the last time. During that time, one of the times the preacher was up there, and that wasn't unusual. The preacher was trying to console or counsel my grandparents, or do whatever a preacher does in that situation. But my granddad wouldn't have anything to do with it. Instead, he wanted to help plan his funeral and wanted to brainstorm with the preacher to try to find out and figure out how they could best use his death to raise money for their church. And looking back on that, it struck me that in my granddad's greatest time of need, when he was literally on his deathbed, he wasn't thinking of himself, but he was thinking of others and thinking of his church. A few years later, my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. She went through a struggle for several years, and we finally moved her from Belton down here to Austin. And when she was in her last stages, we moved her to Westminster Nursing Home off of 38th Street. And one night, I got a call from my mom, about 10:30, 11:30, something like that. She said if I wanted to see my grandmother one time before she passed away, I needed to come down. So I got dressed, got out of bed, and drove down. We don't live probably less than a mile from the nursing home, so there's literally two stops between me and there. And this was a tough time. Not only was I worried about my grandmother, who was going through this horrible fight, but I knew this was also tough on my mom. So I'm struggling with this. It's a hard 3-minute drive, and as I get to the second light, I pull behind a Volvo, and the license plate on the Volvo was J316. Now, I kind of laughed when I was asked to do this because I'm about as far from a theologian as you can get in the church, and if you ask me what it means to be a Christian, I probably don't really have an answer, and certainly the longer I'm here, the more questions I have than answers. But I can take two things from my grandparents' death. First is I think my grandfather lived his life of how you should be a Christian. That if we love, that if we put others before our own needs, and put the church before our own needs, and if I and my wife help raise our kids to try to do the same, that we'll be doing pretty well. And for my grandmother, that no matter where we are, no matter what despair or dark place finds us, Jesus will be there and God will be around to kind of take care of you. It may not be as overt as example of the license plate, but I do take comfort in other hard times that none of us are alone. And I think that's not only true for me, but for all of us. When I was asked to do this, one of the things is my grandfather died in January of 1994, and I got married to my wife a few months later. And one of the unfortunate, if you can say such a thing, timing of his death is that I now wear his wedding ring every day. Not all of us get to have something that ought to remind us not only of our wedding, but also situations like that, time of need when people are surrounded, that God and Jesus are there. I never really thought about it until I was asked to do this, but now I think about my wedding ring, and I hope it's a reminder to me of how we should act and how we should love and are loved.